Hello and welcome to another lecture for History of Journalism. I'm Professor Harper, and today we're going to talk about the Vietnam War, a time of good reporting, bad reporting, and a lot in between, but an important period for American journalism and for the history of the United States. So let's take a look at just getting our bearings. Here is Vietnam, which goes up here and borders China, which was very important in terms of providing support. Here's Laos, which also borders China, and Cambodia, which played a significant role as well. So Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and China. Here's a closer look, Laos going up to the Chinese border, Vietnam here, Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam and capital of the unified Vietnam. And here is Ho Chi Minh City, formerly known as Saigon. Here's Cambodia. And the demilitarized zone is here. The Gulf of Tonkin, which provided the basis for Lyndon Baines Johnson to go into Vietnam in 1964 when an American naval vessel was fired on by Vietnamese forces. Here are some of the key battle areas. So you can look at these in terms of what happened, and you may have heard of some of these places before. So some early history. Vietnam means non-Chinese people of the South, and it was ruled by the Chinese Empire until 938 AD. In the 1600s, French missionaries arrived, and that started the French influence in Vietnam, where French became the second most important language after the arrival of the missionaries. In 1847, French troops were sent to protect Catholics. As you may know, Vietnam is primarily a Buddhist country. 1868, Vietnam surrendered under a peace treaty to become part of the French Empire. And in 1893, Laos and Cambodia were added to the French Empire. Ho Chi Minh was a key leader of the communist forces. He visited the Soviet Union in 1924, and he wrote that it was important that all communists must make contact with the masses to awaken, organize, unite, and train them, and lead them to fight for freedom and independence. It's important to keep in mind that the communists did not come into power in China until 1949, so Ho Chi Minh was an early communist leader. He did stay in China after the fall of China to the communists, and he organized nationalists along the Vietnam border into the Vietnam Revolutionary League. In 1945, Ho announced the formation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The Allied powers had decided that the country would be divided into two, the northern half under the control of the Chinese and the southern half under the British. France attempted to reestablish control of Vietnam and refused to recognize Ho Chi Minh's regime. In 1949, fighting broke out between the Viet Minh and French troops. And in 1954, French surrendered at Dien Bien Phu. I think that Sid has decided to wake up, so he's decided to bark along with the presentation today, so we'll see how it goes. Thanks, Sid. U.S. became involved in the 1950s and early 60s. It's important to keep in mind that in the Korean War from 1950 to 53, the United States lost 142,000 soldiers in Korea in an attempt to stop communism, specifically the Chinese involvement in Korea. In 1954, President Eisenhower sent a small group of military advisors into Vietnam, into the South, and Diem was elected president of South Vietnam with U.S. aid. Diem was Catholic and a small minority in Vietnam, and he decided to imprison his opponents and did not call general elections as he pledged to do if he took power. Now, President Kennedy accepted a theory in Southeast Asia called the domino theory, and the whole notion was that if Vietnam fell, then the dominoes would start to fall, Cambodia, Laos, and that those countries would turn to communism. That's in fact what happened. and those countries remain under a socialist government today. So the Viet Cong, which were the communists in South Vietnam, had grown to a large extent in South Vietnam, and by 1962 Kennedy had sent 12,000 support troops into Vietnam. When LBJ became president, he decided that Vietnam was an important part of American foreign policy. And in August of 1964, the U.S. destroyer Maddox was fired upon in the Gulf of Tonkin, which I mentioned earlier. Congress approved Johnson's decision to bomb Vietnam. After this, and it's important, this wasn't a declaration of war. As you may recall, Congress has to declare war, and by not declaring war, it allowed journalists far more flexibility in terms of how it covered the war, because there wasn't any censorship as occurred in World War II and the Korean War. In 1964, LBJ launched Operation Rolling Thunder of air raids over North Vietnam and parts of South Vietnam. The bombing was supposed to last for 8 weeks, but lasted for 3 years. And in that time, the U.S. dropped 1 million tons of bombs on Vietnam. And the destruction still exists today. In fact, the communist government has set up a variety of sites to show tourists and the Vietnamese people what in fact happened back then. In 1965, General William Westmoreland, who was the head of American troops, developed the strategy of search and destroy, and the objective here was to find and then kill members of the communist forces. One of the key turning points was called the Tet Offensive, and Tet is the new year in Vietnam. And in January 1968, the communist forces launched a huge attack, a conventional attack on U.S. forces. And what's interesting is that many people at the time thought it was a huge victory for the Vietnamese, because the Vietnamese were able to seize part of the U.S. embassy. They were beaten back after a time, but that film made it on all the television networks, and it shocked people that the communists were able to attack the American embassy. In military terms, however, it was a victory for U.S. forces. 37,000 National Liberation Front soldiers were killed, compared with 2,500 Americans. But it did prove that the NLF was willing to fight for the overthrow of the South Vietnamese government. In 1968, President Johnson was told by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara that the U.S. could not win the guerrilla war in Vietnam, and recommended a negotiated withdrawal. In 1968, LBJ announced that he wouldn't run for re-election as president, primarily because there was growing opposition to the war, and there were huge marches with many veterans. And by 1975, the U.S. involvement in Vietnam ended. And the domino theory actually did come into play just a year later, as communist governments were set up in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So that's what we have for today, the Vietnam War, and thanks for listening, and we'll see you online.